we've brought to the table another property professional who's going to talk to us tonight about property management. You know, in this time of change, COVID, there's probably a few aspects that Cameron can bring to the table, but I think more broadly we need to be looking at this on a pretty regular basis anyway. You need to be reviewing what you're doing with your properties. Not, finance we've talked about, but certainly property management is something that you should always consider as a priority. Making sure you get the right tenants, you're getting the right rent reviews, etc. So I've asked Cameron to join us tonight because he is now my preferred property manager for any of my clients, particularly when it comes to the rooming house space. He doesn't just focus on rooming houses. It's something that he pretty much added to his bow on a relatively recent time frame, but he's very good at what he does, and all the feedback I've had from my clients to date have been top notch. So welcome, Cameron. Cameron, I should say that Cameron's from Certainty Property, based out of Sydney, but they do the entire eastern seaboard at this stage. Am I correct in saying that, Cameron?
Yeah, that's correct. So I'm managing director of Certainty Property, and I'm personally based in Sydney, but we do have a team down in Melbourne that looks after all of our Melbourne clients there. So we're a full service property manager and rooming house manager, and we really are, I guess, what you'd call a disruptor in this space, trying to shake up the way things are done and operate on an entirely different model to really any other agency in the country.
Cool. All right, and we'll get into that in more detail soon. But before we get to there, I know that before you jumped into property management, you had a very successful career in the finance business. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and why the transition?
Yeah. So prior to coming into the property management space, I actually worked in private equity. I worked for one of the major players in that space. So when they would go in and acquire new companies, and they would look to basically reinvigorate the management and the operations and really improve things, I'd go in and be quite heavily involved in that. And then I worked at Bloomberg for a couple of years, including a brief stint in London. That was actually where I met my business partner, and he's got a background trading financial derivatives, and we both sort of were having a chat around real estate, and we were really sort of, I guess, looking at property management as an area where, most people who've been in the investment game and in the property game for long enough has all had a pretty poor experience at one time or another with a property manager, and we really thought that was an area that was sort of ripe for disruption and really improving the way things are sort of done. And so we ended up launching our business, and I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think dealing with finance sharks can be no different than dealing with some tenants, I imagine, in some instances. Although we're not here to bag the tenants, because there's some pretty rough landlords out there as well. So I know that actually I'm going to use this most recent referral I've given you as an example. So yesterday, a friend of my wife's approached me about having some difficulties with a tenant at the moment, and we are going through COVID, which probably puts a little bit of a different spin on it, although I don't think this tenant has any excuses. But this particular person has been managing her own property, and now the tenant has stopped communicating to the point where she's even offered, you just pay the power bills like you've been doing and don't even worry about the rent, but no response. So I said, look, best person to talk to is Cameron. The feedback I've had today, Cameron, is she's ecstatic with what you've done for her so far. And she's looking forward to putting the property with you ongoing once it's all fixed. But what is the secret to getting the best tenant for your property?
Absolutely. So that one that you mentioned there, that's been a bit of a horror story. So I very much feel for that poor owner, but it just goes to show, it's one of those things where a lot of people manage their properties themselves, and a lot of the time they're totally fine, and it's similar to insurance. 90% of people will pay insurance and never have a claim, but then when something does go wrong, you really need to call on that and have an expert there, because the situation can evolve pretty quickly. In terms of tenant selection, and really the key to finding a great tenant, I sort of take a very different view on this than a lot of other people in the industry, I guess. If you go into an agency, they're going to tell you how they have the best tenant selection processes and everything like that. That may have been relevant 5 years ago when, it really was an owner's or a landlord's market, and you had a whole lot of applications going as soon as you opened up a property. The reality is as more suppliers come online, and that hasn't been the case for many years, and people who've got new leases coming up sort of, are a bit shocked by how much of a tenant's market it can be at times, especially in straight residential property. For me, the key really is making sure that as many people and as many prospective tenants are seeing that property. Now, the reality of that comes down to making sure that your advertisements are things like premium listings and that sort of thing on the relevant portals, and then being adaptive to the tenants who are serious about the property and coming on their times. I often see property managers, for example, and they might do an open at Tuesday at 11 a.m. and anyone who's working is not going to be able to attend that open, and they're the tenants that you want. So we've adjusted to make sure like a lot of our opens are done between 5 and 7 p.m. at night, and that means I get home a little bit later, but it also means that we're on the schedule of the people who want to see the property, and that means ultimately we get a broader tenant pool, and from there we can then run our pretty detailed tenant vetting processes on a broader pool of people. There's no point having an unbelievable tenant vetting process if you've only got one applicant.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the reality is we're in the service industry, right? Both of us, or anyone that's involved in property, are in a service industry, and we need to remember that at all times. So we've got the good tenant, fantastic. How often should we be looking at reviewing the rent? As you said, the pool now is much larger than it was previously. So how's that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting you mention that, because the laws in different states have been changing. So generally, ideally, what you want, and it very much depends on whether you have a short-term or a long-term tenant. In this current environment, we've been very transparent with people where when owners have reduced the rent by a substantial amount as a result of coronavirus, that will be reviewed, and that this is a bit of an anomaly of what's happening right now. No one knows where the world's going to be in 12 months' time, I should say. Generally, the way it's always been is rent reviews every 6 or 12 months. But that's an interesting point that you have raised, because in New South Wales, they've actually changed the legislation as of March 23rd, which means that you have to actually specify in dollar or percentage terms any rent increases at the start of the lease. So if you sign a 2-year lease, for example, and your intention is to review the rent every 6 months, there's full transparency around what that looks like. And if you don't advise that at the start of the lease, you can't increase the rent. So you can say, for example, the rent will increase by 3% or 4% every 6 months, but you can't, for example, say the rent will increase according to inflation or some, vague metric like that. So, yeah, exactly. So, when one state tends to do something, the others tend to follow. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that is introduced, but I also don't think that that's a bad thing for owners or tenants, having that transparency from the start. So you're both wide-eyed around, what each other's expectations are going into a property.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you touched on what we're going through at the moment. Things are a little bit different now. So what should a landlord be looking to do in this day and age where a tenant's claiming that they can't meet their requirements based on a loss of job or loss of hours, perhaps.
Yeah, so I guess in answering that question, I think it's important to note that in giving this answer as a property manager, that we're working on and we're employed on behalf of a landlord to ensure that their interests are met. So this is maybe a bit different to some of the things that you read around negotiating and that sort of thing. But my honest view on this is that if someone comes to you with a request for a rent reduction, we've got basically a form that the tenants fill out, which really specifies and allows them to provide enough information around their financial position. So things like separation certificates, whether they're accessing job seeker, bank statements, that sort of thing. And what that has really done is flushed out the noise. So we've had some very genuine people who are finding themselves in genuine financial hardship, and people who are in that sort of situation in genuine financial hardship have already got this documentation, etc., because they've needed it to apply, for job seeker or to their bank for relief, etc. Whereas, the people who are just out there saying, "Oh, can I get a rent reduction because I'm a bit nervous about the current environment, even though my financials haven't changed," they say, "I'm not bothered with this." So that's the first step. If you receive that and someone's in genuine hardship, I mean, my view on that is you can't evict a tenant at the moment, but you shouldn't really be reducing rent. I would just be letting the arrears accrue. The reason for that is that, first of all, if you have insurance and they have rent default cover, there's a good chance that they'll cover that, if not all of it. Whereas if you agree to a rent deferment or a rent reduction, you're essentially waiving that liability. Now, that liability lies with the insurer. So I am very hesitant to give insurers a free pass for something that a risk that they've insured against. So you can't evict, and you can sort of make that clear to the tenant that, look, we understand we can't evict you. Please be advised that the arrears are still accruing, and what can you pay? That would be my view. Now, if you don't have insurance, again, I would really be of the view that you let the arrears accrue, and really at the end of this, you see what position you're in 6 months' time. The situation is just so fluid. You could have a situation where the government might come out and say, look, to relieve the burden, we're going to have a rental assistance package that covers off 50% of the arrears to date that have been accrued as a result of coronavirus. Now, I'm not saying that something's going to happen, but by agreeing to rent reductions, you're essentially waiving your rights for perhaps not a whole lot of gain.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just on that, though, we all know insurance companies. They love you until you want to make a claim. Given this is a force majeure, what's the likelihood of them actually paying?
So this is an interesting question, actually. So when all this was happening, we had a lot of conversations with our clients, and quite frankly, it amazes me how many were really uninsured, given some of the horror stories we see in property management every once in a while. So it was interesting to see how many were uninsured, and we were very proactive in reaching out to our clients and making sure that they understood or at least considered insurance. And most of our clients ended up being insured going into this. So that's proved to be quite a good thing. In insurance policies, for example, the major ones like Terry Shear, my understanding is that they have continued paying out on these policies as they, were intended to. I know, for example, Terry Shear, they stopped issuing insurance, sort of 3 weeks ago for new policies, as have most insurers. We've been using EBM since, which is backed by QBE. They have now also put an embargo on new policies, but they were very clear and transparent that if there is rent default as a result of, coronavirus, that they would still be covered, and yeah, so it very much depends on the insurer. But my understanding is the ones who see a long-term future in this business of landlord insurance have done the right thing. So that's been my take.
And look, I think from a potential landlord's perspective, having a property manager that has that understanding of that space and has had those relationships and those conversations, I think this is important as anything. Because a lot of property managers I speak to, when you start talking insurance, they know very little about it. But that's just my experiences to date. So that's a broad stroke overview of property management, I suppose. I want to get into a little bit of detail while we've got a few minutes left, just to sort of talk more about my space, which is the rooming houses, Class 1B rooming houses. So tell me a little bit about your take on managing those and some of the intricacies in managing a rooming house.
Yeah, most definitely. So I guess the first point on managing a rooming house is really understanding that it is a lot more high touch than vanilla standard residential, and there's good reason for that. And a good rooming house manager understands that it's high touch and doesn't treat it like a normal set and forget sort of residential rental, where you might have a touch point with the tenant, say once a month, as opposed to on a more weekly basis. The next generation rooming houses, which I guess you've sort of been involved in, they really do attract a very high quality of tenant. People sometimes have a perception of rooming houses that it really is just people who have got social issues or financial strife, and that really has been the opposite of our experience for the next generation style rooming houses. Now, I might add that is not the experience on some of the I guess the conversion rooming houses or the old school rooming houses. They tend to have a different, I guess, tenant with a different sort of background. But the new generation rooming houses, where they've each got en suites, that sort of thing, these are professional people who are in these premises, or they might be someone, for example, who is widowed and they've got a significant superannuation balance, or is a pensioner, or whatever that looks like. So, but the key on the management side of things really is making sure that you've got very clearly defined house rules, making sure everyone knows, that they've got obligations, not just, to themselves, but also to the 7 or 8 or however many other people that are occupying the property, and that everyone's entitled to peaceful enjoyment. And also on the tenant selection side of things, you want to make sure that people within a rooming house, that their personalities match. So that's an important thing as well. If you put someone in a rooming house who, say, is 18 and has a view that it's their first move out and they want to have friends over, compared to and play loud music, compared to say someone who's looking to say have a bit of rest and relaxation because they're a truck driver who's working most of the week and they want their own place to call home, when they're in town. That doesn't work in a rooming house. So you really want to make sure that you're matching with the personality of the property.
Excellent. Well, look, we're running out of time, so I just wanted to quickly talk about the deal that we've struck for my clients. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of percentages and bits and pieces, because what I would say is there are people out there that sort of charge anywhere from 8% to 30% to manage a rooming house. As Cameron's just touched on there, that 30% is for those really difficult cases, the old property out in the outer suburbs that's been sliced and diced. It's got 1 or 2 bathrooms. I heard one horror story of a walk-in wardrobe being rented out for $150. We're talking about that type of thing. the stuff that I'm doing obviously is completely different. These are built for purpose from the ground up, brand new. So when it comes to pricing to manage that, certainly have that conversation with Cameron. But can we sort of maybe share with the audience the rental guarantee that you'd be able to provide to my clients who are prepared to put these brand new properties with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what we offer, and we're the only rooming house manager to offer rent guarantee, and we do that because we've got a strong relationship with Frank, and we've got a lot of confidence in the properties that you're dealing with. But basically, we underwrite 75% of the gross cash flows that you would receive at full occupancy. So if you imagine, and I'll use round numbers here, but if you imagine, a rooming house that generates $4,000 a week in gross rent when all rooms are full and all tenants are paid, we underwrite $3,000 of those cash flows. So let's say we were to get a week where, just by poor luck, we had a couple of rooms vacant at the same time, and we might have had a tenant paying late. We'll pay that difference out of our own pocket. Obviously, if the rooms are full or there's more income being generated, that gets passed straight through. But it really means that our incentives are very strongly aligned with maximising the investment returns of your clients. The other, element of that you touched on around the fees is you mentioned that fees generally range between 8 up to 30%. Our management fee is less than 8, so we're very competitive on that front as well.
Excellent. Well, that's all I've got for today, and we are over the 20-minute mark now. So, Cam, I really want to thank you for stopping in with us today. On my website, you'll find links to Cameron's site. Anyone that wants a referral through to Cameron, please just email me, drop me a text message. I'm happy to pass on your details, or vice versa. And hopefully you've learned something today, and you can take that stuff to the bank. Let's just reiterate, if you're building one of my properties and it's a rooming house, Cameron's business will underwrite 75%. So basically, at the moment, so very high numbers Cameron quoted there, $4,000 per week, but let's say it's $3,000 per week, you're guaranteed of $2,250 every week from your property. Now, you can't do that with any other residential property in the marketplace that I'm aware of, and we're sort of looking at 8% to 10% yield on an ongoing basis. So you're basically guaranteed 6%, and your typical residential property is going to return between sort of 3 and 4%. So that's where we're at. All right. So just before we close off, Cameron, is there anything else you want to add?
No. Thanks very much for having me, Frank. It's always great chatting with you.
All right, mate. Thanks for stopping by. And next week, guys, I'm going to bring to you hopefully a chat with my preferred broker in the space, and she's going to talk through some of the issues that are happening right now in that space and how you can overcome them. All right, guys, thanks for stopping by. See you next time.